The Israeli parliament has passed the reasonableness bill, part of a package of legislation that would weaken the power of the nation's Supreme Court. The bill strips Israel's Supreme Court of the power to declare the government's decisions unreasonable. It's a major success for Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and his far-right government, and unprecedented in the country's history as well. And now the Supreme Court could rule the bill itself as unreasonable, which could itself trigger a constitutional crisis that could set the government and the court against each other. A wide-scale industrial action is expected to take place. More than 10,000 military personnel may stop reporting for duty. Hundreds of thousands of people are protesting. In March this year, a nationwide strike forced Netanyahu to temporarily freeze the overhaul. For a deeper analysis and some clarity, let's bring in Yaniv Roznai. He's a professor and co-director at the Rubinstein Center for Constitutional Challenges at Reichman University. Thank you so much for joining us. I mean, this is a very complex issue for non-legal experts in your country, let alone outside the country. Can you just explain how this potentially could pit the parliament against the judiciary?
Thank you very much for having me. So I think that the main problem is that this constitutional amendment basically stripping off some jurisdiction of the High Court of Justice is considered by many to be problematic, because this would be opening the door for the rest of the judicial overhaul. And I think this is the main worry, because the government and some ministers have already said that this amendment is only the amuse-bouche. It is just the salads that would open the appetite for the rest of the judicial overhaul. And the problem is that this amendment basically would allow what we call in the literature constitutional capture, capturing gatekeepers and their independent bodies' positions, and putting, loyal governmental personnel in these positions. And this in turn would allow the rest of the judicial overhaul to go through more easily. And this is why it is so worrisome.
But it's also very worrying, isn't it, that it could be referred, the bill effectively could be referred to the Supreme Court, and the court would have to rule on it. And it wouldn't be seen. I mean, it's meant to be an unbiased institution, of course, and I'm sure it is, but it's very hard to rule on yourself, and therefore it'll be drawn into all sorts of controversy. And, if Parliament doesn't like what they do, it's going to be a crisis.
Yes, so I think that the challenge here is that we're not dealing with an ordinary law. This is basically a constitutional amendment. This is an amendment to basic law, the judiciary. And there are already some petitions calling the High Court of Justice to review and perhaps strike down this amendment. And I want to say that the court has various tools in its toolkit to intervene even in such a constitutional amendment. Like many other countries in the world, which prohibits certain amendments to core democratic values, our Supreme Court has already announced that the Knesset, even when it enacts a basic law or amends a basic law, cannot undermine the core values of the state as a Jewish and democratic. Now, I think that the main challenge is, it is quite clear that this amendment violates core democratic values. The only question is, does this amount to really undermining the core values of the state as a democratic state? And I think here the biggest challenge for the court would be to look at the bigger picture, because nowadays, as we know, democracies do not collapse, in a single piece of legislation, but in an incremental process. And this is indeed the first step in an ongoing plan steps, as we already know, because the government is not hiding the big plan. So I think that the court would have to adopt what we call the unconstitutional constitutional amendment doctrine and place the bar already at the first step, when the first step that would, in a way, undermine the judiciary and allow the government more powers to continue with their plan.
What happens if the amendment is referred to the Supreme Court and the Parliament doesn't like the decision? Is there any system for overcoming that?
So this will indeed bring us to a major constitutional crisis, although I have to admit, if an expanded bench of the High Court of Justice, say 11, would declare the constitutional amendment, this law, as unconstitutional, I do not believe that our government will say that they are not respecting this judgment. It's very hard for me to see that happening.
Are you worried there might be a constitutional crisis?
Yes, of course, it's very worrisome, but I think that, it all comes down in this case to the bureaucracy. What would the Attorney General, the police, the military, what will they do? And without a doubt, they will all listen to the court. And I think that the government will listen to the court as well.
OK, Yaniv Roznai, thanks for shedding some light on a very complicated political and judicial challenge coming up for Israel.